Warren Blackwood lay motionless in his study chair, eyes closed, breath steady, pretending to sleep while testing the character of the desperate woman he'd sheltered from the storm. He expected her to rifle through his desk, pocket silver, or sneak food from his kitchen. Instead, what he heard through the darkness made his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years. Elena Frost knelt beside her sleeping son, whispering words that would shatter every wall Warren had built around his grief-hardened heart. This was no ordinary night. This was the beginning of everything changing. If you're ready to discover how a test of character became a journey of redemption, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The winter wind screamed across the Kansas plains like a living thing, battering against the weathered walls of Blackwood Ranch with fists of ice and fury. Inside the main house, Warren Blackwood sat in his leather study chair, the fire burning low in the hearth, casting shadows that danced and twisted across the dark-paneled walls. To anyone watching, he appeared to be sleeping, head tilted back, arms resting on the chair's worn almond armrests, chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of slumber. But Warren Blackwood was wide awake. His eyes, though closed, were alert behind their lids. His breathing, though measured, was carefully controlled. Every muscle in his body remained coiled with tension beneath the facade of rest. He'd been sitting this way for nearly an hour, waiting, listening, testing her. Elena Frost had arrived at his door 3 weeks ago, blown in by the season's worst blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back, a thin shawl, and a 5-year-old boy clutched to her chest. Warren had watched from his upstairs window as she'd collapsed against his gate, her legs finally giving out after what must have been miles of walking through waist-deep snow. He'd stood there for a full minute, war raging inside his chest, before finally, grudgingly, going out to bring them in. He wasn't a charitable man. Hadn't been for 7 years, not since the fever took his wife Catherine and their infant daughter Rose within 3 days of each other. The house that had once rung with laughter and life had become a mausoleum, and Warren, its sole remaining occupant, wandering through rooms that echoed with ghosts. His foreman Jack had urged him to hire help, to bring life back into the empty servants' quarters. The ranch hands whispered that the boss was becoming strange, hollow, a shadow of the man who'd once commanded respect through both strength and fairness. But Warren had refused every suggestion, every offer of companionship. He wanted the emptiness. It matched what lived inside his chest. Then Elena Frost had appeared, and something in her desperation had cracked through his resolve. Maybe it was the boy, small and dark-haired like his Rose might have been. Maybe it was the fact that Elena had asked for nothing, had simply whispered please as she'd fallen unconscious in the snow. Or maybe, Warren thought as he sat in his chair pretending to sleep, maybe he'd taken them in precisely so he could confirm what he already believed about humanity, that people were fundamentally selfish, that given opportunity and desperation, anyone would betray trust. He'd been testing that theory for 3 weeks now. He'd left money on his desk. Nothing obvious. Just a few bills tucked beneath papers where someone cleaning might find them. They'd remained untouched. He'd left the pantry unlocked when he knew Elena was up late. Nothing had gone missing. He'd accidentally mentioned that his wife's jewelry remained in a box in the guest room where Elena slept with her son. The box hadn't been disturbed. Tonight was his final test. He'd announced at dinner that he'd be working late in his study, then he'd come down here, stoked the fire, poured himself a whiskey he hadn't touched, and arranged himself in this chair to wait. The clock on the mantel now read midnight. The household should have been asleep. Warren heard the creak of floorboards on the stairs. His heartbeat quickened, but he kept his breathing steady. Someone was descending from the second floor, trying to be quiet but unable to avoid the groans of the old wood. The footsteps were light, Elena's, not her boy's heavier child's tread. Warren felt something twist in his gut, something that felt uncomfortably like disappointment. So this is it, he thought. This is when she shows her true colors. The study door, which he'd left deliberately ajar, opened wider with a whisper of hinges. Warren had oiled them yesterday, making sure they wouldn't squeak and alert him. Through his closed eyelids, he sensed the change in light as someone entered with a candle. Elena Frost stepped into the room, and Warren waited for the sound of drawers opening, papers rustling, the clink of coins being pocketed. Instead, he heard something entirely unexpected. A soft, sad sigh. "Oh, Mr. Blackwood," Elena's voice whispered into the darkness, so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "You'll catch your death sleeping here with the fire so low." Warren's carefully controlled breathing nearly hitched. He forced himself to remain still as he heard her move across the room. But she didn't go to his desk. She didn't approach the bookshelf where he kept his strong box. Instead, he heard the soft sounds of her tending the fire, the clunk of a log being added, the whisper of the poker stirring the coals to life. Warmth began to bloom across the room, and Warren felt it reach his face like a gentle hand. He heard Elena move again, her footsteps approaching his chair, and every muscle in his body tensed. This was it. This was when she'd search his pockets, or something soft settled over his shoulders. Warren's mind reeled. Elena had draped a blanket over him, the thick wool throw that usually lay across the back of the sofa. She adjusted it carefully, tucking it around his arms with a gentleness that made his throat inexplicably tight. "There," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "At least you'll be warm." But she didn't leave. Warren heard her settle onto the floor near the hearth, heard the rustle of her worn dress as she sat. Then came another sound, one that made his heart clench, small footsteps padding into the room. "Mama?" The boy's voice was sleepy, confused. "Why aren't you in bed?" "Shh, Tommy, quiet now." Elena's voice held gentle reproof. "You'll wake Mr. Blackwood." "But Mama, you're not in bed either." The child's logic was irrefutable. Warren heard Elena pull her son close, heard the soft sound of her kiss on his hair. "I couldn't sleep, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have nights like that. I came down for some water and found Mr. Blackwood asleep in his chair. I was just making sure he stayed warm." "Why doesn't he sleep in his bed like us?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying that particular mixture of curiosity and concern that only children possess. There was a pause. When Elena spoke again, her voice carried a weight that Warren hadn't heard before. "Sometimes, Tommy, when people hurt badly enough on the inside, they forget how to do simple things like go to bed at proper times. Sometimes the hurt is so big it fills up all the rooms in their house, and they don't know how to make space for themselves anymore." "Is Mr. Blackwood hurt inside?" Warren's fingers clenched beneath the blanket, but he kept his face relaxed, kept his breathing even. "Yes, baby. I think he is." "Can we fix him?" The question was asked with such innocent certainty that something in Warren's chest cracked. "Oh, Tommy," Elena's voice wavered. "Some hurts aren't the kind you can fix. Some hurts people have to carry. But you know what we can do?" "What, Mama?" "We can be kind. We can be grateful for the shelter he's given us. We can make sure that while we're here, this house has some light in it again. Not to fix his hurt. That's not our place. But just to show him that kindness still exists. That not everything in this world is loss and loneliness." Warren heard the boy shift, heard the innocent confusion in his voice. "But Mama, who takes care of Mr. Blackwood? Who makes sure he's not lonely?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Warren found himself waiting for Elena's answer with an intensity that unnerved him. "I don't think anyone does, sweetheart. I think Mr. Blackwood has been alone for a very long time. That's why we need to be extra good, extra quiet, extra helpful. Not because we owe him, though we do, more than we could ever repay. But because," her voice dropped to barely a whisper, "because everyone deserves to know that someone notices them. Everyone deserves to know that someone cares whether they're warm at night." "Even if they're grumpy?" Tommy asked. Elena's laugh was soft and sad. "Especially if they're grumpy. Sometimes people are grumpy because they're protecting hurt places inside them. You be patient with Mr. Blackwood, Tommy. He's given us a roof and food when we had nothing. That makes him a good man, even if he doesn't smile much." "Okay, Mama." There was a pause. "I wish we could stay here forever. I like having a real bed, and the barn cat let me pet her today." Warren heard the hitch in Elena's breathing, heard her struggle for composure. "I know, baby. But we can't expect Mr. Blackwood's kindness to last forever. Men like him, they help because it's the right thing to do, but they don't make permanent places for strangers. When the spring thaw comes and the roads are passable again, we'll need to move on. We'll find a town, find work. I'll sew or clean or do whatever needs doing. We'll be all right. But I don't want to go. The child's voice rose slightly, and Elena shushed him quickly. I know, but this isn't our home, Tommy. It's Mr. Blackwood's home, and he's let us stay here out of the goodness of his heart. We can't take advantage of that. We can't overstay our welcome. The best way to repay kindness is to be gracious about it, to not ask for more than what's freely given.
I want to give him something, Tommy insisted. He gave us a home. What can we give him? Warren felt his throat close completely. He'd been waiting for evidence of opportunism, of greed, of the selfishness he'd convinced himself was humanity's true nature. Instead, he was listening to a mother teach her son about dignity, gratitude, and grace in the face of poverty. You already give him something, Elena said softly. Every time you're quiet in the morning so he can sleep. Every time you clean up your toys without being asked. Every time you say thank you, sir, in that polite voice of yours. Those are gifts, Tommy. They might not seem like much, but they're what we have to offer. Is that enough? It has to be, baby. It's all we've got. Warren heard them settle into comfortable silence, heard the crackle of the fire he'd let die down to embers, felt the warmth of the blanket Elena had placed over him.
He lay there, frozen, his chest collapsing around him like a house of cards. She wasn't here to steal. She was here to give, to offer the only thing she possessed, simple human kindness to a man she rightly identified as broken. Mama? Tommy's voice was growing sleepier. Do you think Mr. Blackwood dreams about the people he lost? Warren's heart stopped. What makes you ask that, sweetheart? Elena's voice was very gentle. Because sometimes at night I hear him walking in the hallway. And once I heard him talking to someone, but when I peeked out, he was alone. He was standing by that door at the end of the hall, the one that's always closed. And he sounded so sad, Mama. He sounded like he was crying. Warren's eyes burned behind his closed lids. The boy had heard him that night 2 weeks ago when he'd had too much whiskey and had stood outside the nursery, Catherine and Rose's room, talking to ghosts. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then we must be extra kind, Tommy, because a hurt that big, a loss that deep, that's not something that goes away. That's something a person carries every day for the rest of their life. And if our being here can make even one day a little less heavy for him, then that's a worthy thing. I'll be extra good, Tommy promised, his voice fading toward sleep. I'll be so good he won't even know I'm here. Oh, baby, Elena's voice broke slightly. You're already so good. You're the best thing I've ever done in this whole world. Warren heard her rise, heard her lift her sleeping son. She moved toward the study door, pausing just before she left. He felt her eyes on him, felt the weight of her attention. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. So softly, he knew she believed he couldn't hear. Thank you for the shelter, for the food, for the kindness you pretend you don't possess. I know you think you're a hard man, Mr. Blackwood, but hard men don't take in desperate widows and their children. Hard men let people freeze in the snow. Whatever you think you are, whatever you've convinced yourself you've become, there's still goodness in you. I see it, even if you can't. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading up the stairs with her sleeping child. Warren sat in his chair, the blanket warm around his shoulders, the fire crackling with new life, and let out a breath that shook his entire frame. His test had failed spectacularly, or perhaps it had succeeded in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd expected to prove that people were inherently selfish. Instead, he'd discovered that some people, when given nothing, found ways to give anyway. For the first time in 7 years, Warren Blackwood felt something stir in the frozen wasteland of his chest. It wasn't happiness. He wasn't sure he remembered what that felt like. It wasn't hope. That seemed too ambitious. It was something smaller, more fragile, the faint possibility that maybe, just maybe, his house didn't have to be a tomb forever. He opened his eyes and stared into the fire Elena had rebuilt. The flames danced and twisted, alive and warm, pushing back the darkness. Across the room, the whiskey he'd poured hours ago sat untouched on his desk. He'd been planning to drink himself into oblivion after confirming his suspicions about human nature, after proving to himself that kindness was just another mask people wore until opportunity presented itself. Instead, he found himself standing, his joints stiff from sitting so long, and walking to his desk. He picked up the glass and carried it to the window, looking out at the frozen expanse of his land. Snow stretched to the horizon, pristine and merciless, beautiful and deadly. Out there, Elena and her son would have died, would have frozen and been buried until spring thaw revealed their bodies. He'd saved them from that. But the question that gnawed at him now was, who was going to save him? Warren poured the whiskey back into its decanter and returned to his chair. The blanket still held Elena's warmth, carried the faint scent of the lavender soap she used sparingly, making each bar last as long as possible. He pulled it around himself properly and stared into the fire. In the morning, he would pretend this night never happened. He would be the same gruff, distant man he'd been for 3 weeks. He would maintain the walls that kept people at arm's length, that protected the raw wound of his grief from exposure. But something had changed. Something had cracked. And Warren Blackwood wasn't sure whether to be terrified or relieved. The days that followed took on a strange new quality. Warren went through his usual routines, rising before dawn, checking on the livestock, meeting with his foreman Jack about ranch business, eating meals in silence. But now he found himself noticing things he'd deliberately ignored before. He noticed how Elena rose even earlier than him, how she had hot coffee waiting when he came down, how she never asked for thanks or acknowledgement. He noticed how she mended his shirts without being asked, how she somehow made the meals stretch further without them tasting like poverty. He noticed how his house had begun to smell like living again, like bread baking and fires burning, and the particular scent of soap and clean things. He noticed Tommy, too, the boy who kept himself small and quiet, who played with wooden spoons and bits of string because those were the toys he had. The boy who said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," and "Thank you, sir," with such earnest politeness that it made Warren's chest hurt. The boy who watched Warren with huge dark eyes that held no fear, only curiosity and a child's uncomplicated desire to understand the world. 3 days after the night in the study, Warren walked into the kitchen to find Tommy standing on a chair at the counter, carefully shaping biscuit dough under Elena's watchful eye. The boy's tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, his small hands working with determined precision. "Gentle, baby," Elena instructed softly. "Too much handling makes them tough." "Like Mr. Blackwood?" Tommy asked innocently. Warren froze in the doorway, unseen. Elena's laugh was startled and warm. "Tommy, you can't say things like that." "But you said handling life too rough makes people tough. I was just thinking, that's hard, baby, not tough. And—" She paused, seemed to consider. "Actually, maybe you're right. Maybe too much hard handling does make people tough. But that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes toughness is what keeps people standing when everything else tries to knock them down." "Is that why Mr. Blackwood doesn't fall down even though he's sad?" Elena's hands stilled on the biscuit dough. "Yes, sweetheart. I think that's exactly why." Warren cleared his throat, making his presence known. Both Elena and Tommy jumped. Tommy nearly fell off his chair, but Elena caught him with practiced ease, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Mr. Blackwood, I didn't hear you come in. I hope you don't mind. Tommy wanted to help with breakfast, and I thought, it's fine." Warren's voice came out gruffer than he intended, rough from disuse and discomfort. He wasn't used to conversations, to explaining himself. "Teach the boy what you want. It's your kitchen." "Oh, no, sir. It's your kitchen. We're just—" "I meant what I said." He turned to leave, then paused, the words sticking in his throat like thorns. But he forced them out anyway, made himself speak them into being. "The biscuits you made yesterday, they were good." The silence that followed was profound. Warren didn't turn around, didn't want to see Elena's face, didn't want to witness the impact of what amounted to the first compliment he'd given anyone in 7 years. He heard her breath catch, heard the soft surprise in her voice when she finally spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Thank you." He left before the moment could stretch into something more complicated, but he heard Tommy's excited whisper behind him. "Mama, he liked them. Mr. Blackwood liked your biscuits." And Elena's response, warm with pleasure and surprise.
He did, didn't he? Well then, I guess we'll have to make sure they're extra good from now on.
Warren walked out into the frozen morning, breath clouding in the bitter air, and felt that crack in his chest widen just slightly. It hurt, that widening. It hurt like thawing frostbite, like blood returning to numb limbs, but he didn't stop it. That night, Warren stayed in his study again, this time genuinely working on the ranch accounts. He heard the house settle around him, heard the creak of footsteps on the floor above, heard the low murmur of Elena reading to Tommy before bed. He forced himself to focus on the numbers in front of him, columns of expenses and income that needed balancing. Around midnight, he set down his pen and allowed himself to acknowledge what he'd been waiting for. The soft sound of someone descending the stairs. This time, he didn't pretend to sleep. When Elena entered the study, moving quietly toward the dying fire, he spoke. "You don't need to do that." Elena spun around, hand pressed to her chest, eyes wide in the candlelight. "Mr. Blackwood, I thought you'd gone up hours ago. I didn't mean to disturb—" "You didn't disturb anything." Warren set his pen down carefully, not looking at her. "But you don't need to come down here every night. I'm capable of tending my own fire." In the silence that followed, Warren heard Elena's breathing change. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "How long have you known? That you've been coming down here?" "Since the first night." More silence. Then, "I see. I apologize, Mr. Blackwood. It was presumptuous of me. It won't happen again." She turned to leave, and Warren found himself speaking before he consciously decided to. "I didn't say I wanted you to stop." Elena paused, her back to him. Warren stared at his ledgers, at the numbers that suddenly seemed meaningless, and forced himself to continue. "The house is warmer in the mornings because of it. That's practical. Efficient use of firewood." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The warmth had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with the fact that someone cared whether he froze in his chair. But Warren couldn't say that out loud, couldn't crack himself open that far. So he hid behind practicality, behind the language of ranch management and resource allocation. Elena turned slowly. In the dim light, her face was hard to read, but her voice was soft when she spoke. "Then I'll continue to be practical and efficient, Mr. Blackwood, if that's all right with you." "It is." She moved to the fire, added wood with the practiced ease of someone who'd been managing on her own for a long time. Warren watched her hands, work-roughened and capable, and wondered what her story was. He'd never asked. In 3 weeks, he'd never once inquired about where she'd come from, what had led her to his door, what had happened to her husband. "Your husband," he heard himself say, the words escaping before he could stop them. "How long has he been gone?" Elena's hands stilled on the poker. 2 years this January. Influenza took him in the space of a week." "I'm sorry." The words felt foreign in his mouth, rusty from disuse. "Thank you." She set the poker down, straightened. "We had 6 good years together. I try to be grateful for that instead of bitter about what was taken. Doesn't always work, but I try." Warren found himself speaking into the fire, telling truths he'd never voiced aloud. "My wife and daughter, 7 years ago, fever." His throat closed around the rest of it, the helplessness, the rage. The way Rose had reached for him with tiny hands one moment and gone still the next. The way Catherine had followed their daughter 3 days later, whispering, "Take care of her," with her last breath even though Rose was already gone. "I know," Elena said softly. Warren's head snapped up. "What?" "I'm sorry. I don't mean to intrude, but when you're staying in someone's home, you see things." "There are pictures in the guest room, a wedding photograph, a baby's christening gown in the wardrobe. She paused, seemed to choose her words carefully. "I know the particular silence of a house where people are missing. My home sounds the same way without my husband's voice in it." Warren stared at her, this woman who'd been sleeping in his dead wife's favorite room, surrounded by Catherine's things, by Rose's tiny clothes, and who had said nothing. Who had kept his grief sacred, who had not pried or prodded or offered empty platitudes. "Why did you leave?" he asked. "Where were you going when the storm caught you?" Elena moved to the window, looked out at the frozen darkness. "After my husband died, I tried to keep going. Tried to keep our little house, take in sewing, make it work. But I couldn't keep up with the rent. The landlord was patient for a while, but patience runs out when people need money. We got evicted 3 months ago.
3 months? Warren's voice sharpened. You've been on the road for 3 months? In winter?
We stayed where we could. Churches mostly, charity homes. I took work where I found it, a few days here, a week there. But charity has limits, Mr. Blackwood, and I had no skills beyond sewing and basic housework. No family, no connections. I thought if I could get to my cousin in Nebraska, we might... She shook her head. But Nebraska is far and the snow came early this year. We were trying to reach the next town when the storm hit. We'd have died if you hadn't... Her voice cracked slightly. If you hadn't opened your door. Warren absorbed this, the brutal reality of it. She'd been walking toward Nebraska, still hundreds of miles away, with nothing but a child and hope. The odds of making it had been next to nothing. The fact that they'd reached his ranch alive was either providence or sheer stubborn luck. Your cousin, he said. You have family waiting? Elena's laugh was bitter. I have a cousin I haven't seen in 10 years who may or may not remember my existence. That's not family, Mr. Blackwood. That's just a name I wrote down because the alternative was having nowhere to aim for. The fire crackled between them. Outside, wind howled across the plains, rattling the windows with fingers of ice. Inside, 2 people who understood loss stood in silence, the space between them filled with all the words they didn't know how to say. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice steady despite its softness. I'll stay as long as you permit it. Through the winter, if you're that generous. And when spring comes, I'll take Tommy and move on. I won't presume on your kindness forever, Mr. Blackwood. But while I'm here, I'll earn my keep. I'll keep your house warm and your meals cooked and your shirts mended. Not because I'm trying to secure a permanent place, I know better than to hope for that, but because it's what I can do. And because, she paused, met his eyes across the dim room. Because you gave us our lives back, and that deserves whatever gratitude I can offer. Warren wanted to say something, wanted to tell her she didn't owe him anything, that he'd acted on impulse rather than virtue. But the words wouldn't come, so instead he nodded, a short, sharp movement, and returned his attention to his ledgers. Elena took this as the dismissal it was. But before she left, she did something unexpected. She went to the desk, picked up the empty coffee cup Warren had been drinking from hours ago, and replaced it with a fresh cup from the pot she must have kept warm in the kitchen. The coffee steamed in the cold room, rich and dark. You should sleep, she said quietly, but if you won't, at least stay warm. Then she was gone, leaving Warren alone with his numbers and his thoughts and a cup of coffee that tasted like someone cared. He sat there for a long time after she left, staring at nothing, feeling the walls he'd built so carefully beginning to develop fissures. It terrified him, that cracking. It felt like dying and being born at the same time, like waking up from a long, cold sleep to discover the world had continued without him. The coffee grew cold in his hands, but Warren didn't move. He sat in his study, in the house that had been a tomb for 7 years, and listened to it breathe with new life. Upstairs, Elena and Tommy slept in the room where Catherine had once planned their future. Down here, Warren sat surrounded by 7 years of silence and began, just barely, to imagine what sound might feel like again. It wasn't healing, it wasn't even close to healing, but it was the first tiny step away from the grave he'd been living in, and that was enough. For now, that was enough. The pattern established itself quietly, like snow accumulating on a windowsill, so gradual that Warren didn't notice until it had already transformed the landscape of his days. Every morning, he woke to the smell of coffee already brewing. Every evening, he returned from the cold to find the house warm, the lamps lit, something cooking that made the kitchen smell like a home instead of a building. And every night, long after the household had supposedly gone to sleep, Elena came down to tend his fire, to leave small comforts he pretended not to notice. A week after their conversation in the study, Warren came in from checking the livestock to find his heavy coat, which had been missing 2 buttons for months, hanging by the door with the buttons replaced. He stood there staring at it for a full minute, running his thumb over the new buttons, simple brown things that matched the originals perfectly. Elena must have searched through Catherine's old sewing basket to find them. He didn't thank her, didn't know how to acknowledge the gesture without making it into something bigger than he could handle. But that night, he left an extra log by the fireplace in his study, making her nightly task easier. It was the only language he had. Tommy began appearing in unexpected places. Warren would walk into the barn to find the boy sitting cross-legged in the hay, talking softly to the barn cats. He'd glance out his study window and see small footprints in the snow, tracing elaborate patterns in the yard. Once he opened the door to the storage room and discovered Tommy organizing scattered tools, his small face scrunched in concentration as he tried to figure out where each item belonged. "I wasn't snooping, sir," Tommy said quickly, dropping the hammer he'd been holding. "I just thought, Mama says we should help where we can, and I saw these were all mixed up, so I thought, it's fine." Warren picked up the hammer, hung it on its proper hook. "You know where this goes?" Tommy shook his head. "Here, and the saw goes there. Nails in that drawer, sorted by size." Warren demonstrated, aware of the boy watching his every movement with intense focus. "Think you can remember that?" "Yes, sir." Tommy's face lit up with pleasure so pure it was almost painful to witness. "I'll remember all of it. I'm good at remembering." Warren grunted, turned to leave, then paused. "The cat's in the barn. Don't pick up the orange one. She's mean." "Oh, I know, sir. She scratched me yesterday. But I think she's just scared, not mean. Mama says sometimes people act mean when they're really just frightened." Warren looked at the boy, at his earnest face and his two old eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. "Your mother's right, but the cat will still scratch you." "That's okay. I'll just be patient. Mama says patience is how you teach scared things that they're safe." The words hung in the cold air of the storage room. Warren wondered if Elena had been talking about the cat at all, or if her son had somehow understood a lesson meant for an entirely different subject. He left without responding, but he found himself thinking about it for the rest of the day. That evening at dinner, the first meal Warren had shared with them since they'd arrived, sitting at the table instead of taking his plate to his study, Tommy asked a question that made Elena choke on her water. "Mr. Blackwood, why do you have a room you never open?" "Tommy!" Elena's face flushed with mortification. "That's not… You can't ask." "It's at the end of the hall," Tommy continued, oblivious to his mother's distress. "The door with the pretty carved flowers. I saw you standing in front of it the other night. You looked so sad." Warren's hand stilled on his fork. The nursery. Catherine had been so proud of that door, had commissioned it specially when she learned she was pregnant. Roses and vines carved into the wood, a celebration of life and hope and all the future they'd thought they'd have. "Tommy, apologize right now." Elena's voice was sharp with horror. "Mr. Blackwood's home is his private… It was my daughter's room." Warren's voice cut through Elena's apology, rough as gravel. "She died there. I haven't opened it since." The silence that fell was absolute. Tommy's eyes went wide, his small face crumpling with understanding and regret. Elena looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. Warren picked up his fork and resumed eating, though the food tasted like ash. "I'm sorry," Tommy whispered. "I didn't mean to make you sad." "You didn't make me sad, boy. I was already sad. You just asked about it." Warren took a drink of water, forced himself to meet Tommy's stricken gaze. "It's not wrong to ask questions, but some questions have answers that hurt. I won't ask any more, I promise. Asking isn't the problem." Warren set his glass down carefully. "The problem is when people ask and then tell you how you should feel about the answers, or when they ask and then expect you to pretend the hurt isn't there. You didn't do either of those things." Elena was staring at him with an expression Warren couldn't decipher. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be in my study." He left his half-finished dinner and retreated to the only space that still felt entirely his. But even there, he couldn't escape the image of Tommy's face, the child's innocent question exposing wounds Warren had convinced himself were safely hidden. An hour later, there was a soft knock on his door. Warren didn't answer, but the door opened anyway. Elena entered carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like apple cake. Where she'd found apples in the middle of winter, he had no idea. "I'm not hungry," he said without turning around. "Then the cake will keep." Elena set the tray down on the small table near the fire. "I wanted to apologize for Tommy. He doesn't understand boundaries yet. I'll speak with him. Don't. Warren finally turned to face her. Don't teach him not to see what's right in front of him. Don't teach him to pretend pain doesn't exist just because it makes people uncomfortable. Elena studied him in the firelight, her expression thoughtful. Is that what people did to you? Pretended your pain didn't exist? They tried to fix it. Tried to tell me time would heal it, that I'd move on, that I'd find happiness again. As if grief was a cold you recover from, instead of an amputation you learn to live with. Warren's voice was bitter. After a while they stopped coming around, easier that way. For everyone. I won't do that. Elena moved closer, her voice steady. I won't try to fix you, and I won't pretend your grief is something you should hide. But I also won't let you drown in it unchallenged. Not while I'm in this house. Warren's laugh was harsh. You think you can save me, Mrs. Frost? Is that what this is? Some kind of missionary work? No. Elena's eyes flashed with something sharp. I think you're drowning yourself on purpose, and I think you've been doing it for so long you've forgotten there's air above the water. I'm not trying to save you, Mr. Blackwood. I'm just refusing to watch a good man waste away without at least holding up a mirror so he can see what he's become. The words hit like a slap. Warren stepped closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. And what have I become, Mrs. Frost? Tell me, since you figured it all out. Lonely. The word was soft but unyielding. You've become lonely. Not alone, lonely. There's a difference. Alone is a state of being. Lonely is a choice. She held his gaze without flinching. You've built walls so high that nothing can reach you, and now you're suffocating inside them. And the worst part is, you know it. You know it, and you're so terrified of hurting again that you'd rather slowly die of isolation than risk caring about anything. Warren's breath came hard. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. Elena's voice gentled slightly. I know you pull your dead wife's blanket over yourself at night even though it's threadbare. I know you stand outside your daughter's door every Tuesday evening at exactly 7 o'clock, the same time every week, like a ritual. I know you rebuilt the fire in the barn 3 times last week because the newborn calf reminded you of something you lost. I know because I see you, Mr. Blackwood. Maybe for the first time in 7 years, someone is actually seeing you. Warren felt his carefully constructed defenses cracking, felt the walls developing fissures he couldn't repair. Stop. Why? Because it hurts? Elena's eyes held his. Everything hurts. Living hurts. But at least it's living. My wife and daughter are dead. The words exploded from Warren with all the force of 7 years' suppression. They died in my arms, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't save them. I couldn't do anything but watch them slip away. So yes, I built walls. Yes, I chose lonely over the alternative, because caring about people means watching them die, and I can't— His voice broke. I can't do that again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with truth. When Elena spoke again, her voice was impossibly gentle. I understand. I do. When my husband died, I wanted to die too. The only thing that stopped me was Tommy needing his mother. But I understand that impulse to just stop, to refuse to engage with a world that takes everything you love. Then why are you pushing me? Warren's voice was raw. Because you saved my life. Elena stepped closer, her eyes bright in the firelight. You saved my son's life. And now I'm watching you waste yours, and I can't— Her voice caught. I can't just stand by and watch that happen. Not when there's still so much life left in you, buried under all that grief. Warren turned away, his hands clenching into fists. You should go. I will. But first, eat the cake. It's from Catherine's recipe book. I found it in the kitchen drawer. I hope that's all right. I thought— She paused. I thought maybe you'd want to taste something she made. Something that carried her love forward. Warren's throat closed completely. He heard Elena leave, heard the soft click of the door, and then he was alone with a slice of apple cake made from his dead wife's recipe by a woman who saw too much and understood too little, and somehow, impossibly, both. He sat down heavily and picked up the fork. The first bite tasted like memory, sweet and painful,
and so achingly familiar that tears burned his eyes. Catherine had made this cake for every birthday, every celebration, every Tuesday evening dinner. It was her signature, her gift, her way of saying I love you without words. Warren ate every bite, and with each forkful, he felt the past 7 years pressing down on him like a physical weight. But he also felt something else, something he'd been running from since the night he'd pretended to sleep while Elena taught her son about kindness. The faint, terrifying possibility that maybe he didn't want to be alone forever. That night, when Elena came down to tend his fire, Warren didn't pretend to work. He sat in his chair and watched her move through her ritual, the careful addition of logs, the precise arrangement to maximize heat and minimize smoke. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every movement count, every resource stretch. "You were right," he said into the quiet. Elena turned, surprise flickering across her face. "About what?" "I'm lonely. I have been for 7 years." Warren stared into the fire. "After they died, people kept telling me I'd heal. That time would make it better. But it didn't get better. It just got distant. Like looking at my life through glass. And after a while, the distance felt safer than the alternative." Elena sat down in the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak, just waited. "I tested you," Warren continued, the confession spilling out before he could stop it. "That first night you came down here. I pretended to sleep because I wanted to see what you'd do. I wanted proof that people are fundamentally selfish, that given opportunity, anyone would take advantage." "I know," Elena said softly. Warren's head snapped up. "What?" "I knew you were awake. Your breathing was too controlled, too measured. People who are really asleep breathe differently." A small smile touched her lips. "I've spent 2 years sleeping in charity homes and church basements, Mr. Blackwood. You learn to tell when people are watching you. Then why? Because you needed to see for yourself." Elena leaned forward slightly. "You needed proof that not everyone would betray your trust. And I needed you to know that I was here for the right reasons. So I let you watch. I let you test. And I hoped that maybe, eventually, you'd let yourself believe that kindness can be real." Warren absorbed this, the quiet manipulation of it, the gentle way she'd outmaneuvered his cynicism. "You're either very wise or very manipulative. Can I be both?" The smile in her voice was audible. Despite everything, Warren felt his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile. He wasn't capable of that yet, but something close. "Thank you for the cake." "You're welcome. I'll make it again next Tuesday, if that's all right." Tuesday, 7 o'clock. The time Catherine had always served dinner, the time Warren now spent standing outside the nursery, talking to ghosts. Elena knew this, had figured it out, and was offering to fill that hollow space with something living. That would be... Warren struggled for words. "Acceptable." "Acceptable," Elena repeated, amusement threading through her voice. "High praise indeed." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, wind howled across the plains, but inside, the house held steady against the cold. Warren found himself studying Elena in the firelight, the way exhaustion shadowed her eyes, the way her shoulders carried tension even in rest, the way her hands bore the marks of too much hard work and too little care. "You're tired," he observed. "I'm always tired. It's the natural state of motherhood." But she said it without complaint, stated it as simple fact. "When do you sleep?" Elena's laugh was soft and slightly bitter. "When Tommy sleeps, which means whenever he wakes, I wake. It's been that way since he was born. You learn to function on fragments of rest." Warren remembered Catherine saying something similar when Rose was an infant, remembered the deep exhaustion in her eyes even as she smiled down at their daughter. The memory was sharp enough to cut. "You should go to bed," he said gruffly. "I don't need watching." "I know you don't need it." Elena stood, smoothed her worn dress. "But maybe I need to do it anyway. Maybe making sure you're warm helps me sleep better." She left before Warren could respond to that, left him alone with the implications. He sat in his chair for a long time after she'd gone, turning over her words like stones, examining them from every angle. Maybe she needed to care for him.
Maybe, in the same way that he needed isolation to survive his grief, she needed purpose to survive hers. Maybe they were both just broken people trying to find ways to keep breathing, and maybe, just maybe, they'd accidentally found a rhythm that worked for both of them. It was a dangerous thought. It implied connection, implied need, implied all the things Warren had sworn off when he'd buried his family. But it was also, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, the truth. The next morning, Warren made a decision that surprised even himself. He found Tommy in the barn, still organizing tools with dedicated focus, and cleared his throat. The boy jumped, spun around, his face lighting up with nervous pleasure. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm almost done. Just the small nails left to sort, and then leave them. I need help with something else." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Really? I mean, yes, sir. What do you need?" Warren led the boy to the stables, where his 3 remaining horses stood in their stalls. He'd sold most of the livestock over the years, unable to care about the ranch the way it deserved, but he'd kept the horses. Catherine had loved horses. "This is Ash," Warren said, gesturing to the gray mare. "That's Storm, and the bay is called Copper. They need exercise, but I can't ride them all. You're going to learn to help." Tommy's face transformed with joy so intense it was almost painful to witness. "You're going to teach me to ride?" "I'm going to teach you to care for horses. Riding comes after you prove you can handle the responsibility." Warren opened Ash's stall, led her out. "First lesson? Horses are bigger and stronger than you. They know it, and you need to respect it. But if you're calm and confident, they'll trust you. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Tommy was practically vibrating with excitement. Warren spent the next hour teaching the boy the basics: how to approach a horse, how to read their body language, how to brush them properly. Tommy absorbed every word like a sponge, asking intelligent questions and following instructions with careful precision. The boy had his mother's attention to detail, her careful way of handling fragile things. They were finishing up when Elena appeared in the barn doorway, her face creased with worry. "Tommy, I've been looking everywhere." She stopped, took in the scene. "What's happening?" "Mama, Mr. Blackwood is teaching me about horses." Tommy was brushing Ash's flank with careful strokes, his tongue stuck out in concentration. "Did you know they can tell if you're scared? And that you have to brush them in the direction of their hair, not against it? And—" "I'm putting the boy to work," Warren interrupted, uncomfortable with Elena's scrutinizing gaze. "He's been underfoot. Might as well make himself useful." Elena's expression said she didn't believe his gruff explanation for a second, but she played along. "I see. That's very generous of you, Mr. Blackwood. Tommy, are you behaving yourself?" "Yes, Mama. I'm being so good. Watch." Tommy demonstrated his brushing technique with such earnest pride that even Warren felt something warm flicker in his chest. "Very impressive." Elena's eyes met Warren's over Tommy's head. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. Warren grunted, turned away, focused on coiling a lead rope with unnecessary intensity. But he was aware of Elena watching, aware of the gratitude radiating from her like heat from a fire. It made him uncomfortable, that gratitude. Made him feel like he was doing something meaningful, when all he was doing was teaching a boy basic horsemanship to keep him occupied. Except that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Tommy spent his mornings helping Warren with ranch work, feeding livestock, organizing tools, learning the 1,000 small tasks that kept a property functioning. Elena continued her quiet campaign of domestic care, filling the house with warmth and order, and every night she came down to tend Warren's fire while he pretended not to need it. The house began to change. Not dramatically. Warren wasn't ready for dramatic, but in small, almost imperceptible ways. Fresh herbs appeared on the kitchen windowsill, growing in chipped teacups. The curtains in the parlor, which had been drawn for 7 years, suddenly opened one morning, letting in weak winter light. Furniture got rearranged, pictures straightened, surfaces freed from dust. Warren noticed but said nothing. Let Elena do what she needed to do. Let her restore life to dead spaces. He found he could tolerate it as long as she didn't touch 3 things: Catherine's room, which remained locked, Rose's nursery, which stayed closed, and the small locked cabinet in his study where he kept their most precious belongings.
Those were his. Those remained sacred, but everything else could be negotiated.
One evening, Warren came in from a particularly brutal day. A fence had collapsed in the wind, 3 head of cattle had wandered off, and one of his ranch hands had quit without notice, to find Tommy sitting at the kitchen table, crying silently while Elena wrapped his hand in clean cloth. "What happened?" Warren's voice came out sharper than intended. "Nothing, sir." Elena didn't look up. "Tommy was helping me with dinner and burned his hand on the stove. It's not serious." But Tommy's tears weren't stopping, and the boy's shoulders shook with the effort of keeping quiet. Warren recognized that particular brand of crying, the kind where you're trying desperately not to be a burden, where you're failing at even basic tasks and feeling worthless because of it. He'd cried like that at his wife's funeral. Warren crossed to the table, knelt down to Tommy's level. Something he never did. Something that cost him considerable pride. "Let me see." Tommy extended his bandaged hand with obvious reluctance. Warren unwrapped it carefully, examined the burn. Not serious, as Elena had said, but painful enough. The boy's palm was red and blistered where he'd grabbed a hot pan handle. "Hurts?" Warren asked. Tommy nodded, still crying. "Good. Pain means you'll remember not to grab hot metal. That's how you learn." Warren's voice was gruff but not unkind. He rewrapped the hand with careful precision. "My father taught me blacksmithing when I was about your age. First week, I burned myself so many times I couldn't use my hands for days. You know what he told me?" Tommy shook his head. He said, "Wah, boy, every scar is a lesson you won't forget. Either you learn from the pain or you're a fool." "You going to be a fool, Tommy?" "No, sir." The boy's tears were slowing. "Then stop crying and start learning. You made a mistake. The burn will remind you not to make it again. That's all." Warren stood, his knees protesting the movement. "Now wash your face and set the table with your good hand. Your mother's been cooking, and the least you can do is help serve it." Tommy scrambled to obey, his tears forgotten in the face of having a task to complete. Elena watched Warren with an expression he couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and wonder, and a softness that made him deeply uncomfortable. "That was—" She paused. "Thank you. I didn't do anything." Warren moved to the sink, washing his hands with unnecessary thoroughness. Boy needed to stop feeling sorry for himself. "You gave him exactly what he needed. How did you know?" Warren dried his hands, kept his back to her. "Because someone did the same for me once. Long time ago. Different pain, same principle." They ate dinner together that night. A real dinner at the table, with conversation and the passing of dishes and Tommy chattering about the horses between careful bites taken with his good hand. Warren participated minimally, responding in grunts and single syllables, but he participated. And when Tommy asked if he could help with the horses again tomorrow, despite his burned hand, Warren found himself saying yes. After dinner, after Tommy had gone to bed, Warren sat in his study and felt the weight of the day settling into his bones. He was tired. The kind of tired that came from carrying grief like a stone for so long that you forgot what it felt like to walk without it. But he was also something else, something he couldn't quite name. Less alone, maybe. Less determined to be isolated. Elena came down at her usual time, added wood to his fire with practiced efficiency. But instead of leaving immediately, she settled into the chair across from him, the chair that had become hers over the past weeks without either of them acknowledging it. "He loves you," she said quietly. Warren's head jerked up. "What?" "Tommy. He's been talking about you constantly. Mr. Blackwood this, Mr. Blackwood that. He asked me tonight if he could call you Uncle Warren." Elena's smile was soft. "I told him that was too familiar, that he needed to keep calling you sir." "But?" Warren heard the unspoken question. "But I wanted you to know, in case—" She paused. "In case it mattered to you, that a little boy looks up to you, that you've become important to him." The words landed like stones in Warren's chest. Important. He'd become important to someone again. The thought terrified him. "Don't let him get attached," Warren said roughly. "You're leaving in spring. Best if he understands this is temporary." "I know." Elena's voice was sad.
I remind him every day. But children don't understand temporary the way we do. They live in the now. And right now, you're the closest thing to a father he's had in 2 years. I'm not his father. I know that too. Elena stood, prepared to leave. But, try telling a 5-year-old boy that the man teaching him about horses, the man who bandaged his burn and made him feel brave instead of stupid, the man who's shown him more patient attention in a month than most people show in a lifetime. Try telling him that man isn't important, that man isn't worth loving. She left Warren alone with that truth, left him sitting in the firelight wrestling with implications he wasn't ready to face. Because if Tommy loved him, that meant Warren had failed at his primary goal, keeping everyone at a distance where they couldn't hurt him. And if Elena knew her son loved him and was still planning to leave, that meant she understood the risks of staying, understood that Warren was a fortress with no door. But it also meant that despite everything, despite his walls and his grief and his deliberate isolation, something had gotten through. Someone had gotten through. 2 someones, actually. A desperate widow and her lonely child had cracked open the tomb Warren had built and let light in. And Warren didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Both, probably. Definitely both. February arrived with false promises of spring, 3 days of warmth that melted the top layer of snow into treacherous slush before the temperature plummeted again, freezing everything into jagged ice. Warren was in the barn checking on a mare with a swollen hock when he heard Tommy's scream. He was running before conscious thought caught up, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't since the night Rose stopped breathing. He burst through the barn door to find Elena on the ground, her face paper white, one hand pressed to her side while the other reached uselessly toward Tommy, who stood frozen in the snow, sobbing. What happened? Warren dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her body. Slipped on the ice. Elena's voice was tight with pain. I'm fine. Just give me a moment. But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. Warren caught her before she hit the ground again and felt the heat radiating through her dress. Fever. The realization hit him like a fist. How long have you been sick? I'm not. Don't lie to me. Warren's voice was sharp with fear that came out as anger. How long? Elena's eyes met his, and he saw the exhaustion there, the bone-deep weariness she'd been hiding. 3 days, maybe 4. It's just a cold. I thought I could work through it. A cold doesn't make you collapse. Warren scooped her up, ignoring her weak protests. She weighed nothing, he realized with horror. Had she been eating enough? Had he been so wrapped up in his own walls that he hadn't noticed her wasting away? Tommy, open the door, now! The boy scrambled to obey, his face streaked with tears and terror. Warren carried Elena into the house, up the stairs, deposited her on the bed in the guest room with more gentleness than he knew he possessed. Her skin burned under his hands, and when he pulled back the collar of her dress to check her neck, he saw the swollen glands, the flush that spoke of serious infection. I need to keep working, Elena mumbled, already trying to sit up. Dinner needs... Tommy needs... What Tommy needs is his mother alive. Warren pushed her back down with one hand. And what you need is rest and medicine and to stop being a damned fool. He turned to find Tommy standing in the doorway, small and terrified and looking for someone to tell him what to do. Warren's chest tightened. He was the last person who should be comforting a frightened child. He didn't know how, hadn't known how since Rose... Mr. Blackwood? Tommy's voice was very small. Is Mama going to die? The question punched through Warren's panic like a blade. He looked at this child who'd lost his father, who'd spent months wandering homeless, who'd finally found something like safety, only to watch it crumble again. And Warren realized with sudden, awful clarity that his answer mattered more than almost anything he'd ever said. He knelt down to Tommy's level, made himself meet those frightened eyes. No, your mama is sick, but she's not going to die. I won't let that happen. Do you understand me? You promise? Warren thought of all the promises he'd made and failed to keep. Thought of telling Catherine he'd protect her, telling Rose Daddy would make her better. Thought of every assurance that had turned to ash in his mouth. But he looked at Tommy's desperate face and made a promise anyway, because sometimes the lie was kinder than the truth. I promise. Now I need you to be brave while I take care of her.
Can you do that? Tommy nodded, swiping at his tears with the back of his hand. What do I do? Go to the kitchen, make tea. You've watched your mother do it. Bring me clean cloths and the coldest water you can find. And Tommy? Warren waited until the boy met his eyes. Your mother's going to be fine, but she needs us to be strong for her right now. Can you be strong? Yes, sir. Tommy's voice steadied, given purpose and direction. He ran off to complete his tasks, leaving Warren alone with Elena. She was mumbling now, fevered and incoherent, her body shaking with chills despite the heat radiating from her skin. Warren pulled every blanket he could find, tucked them around her with hands that trembled more than they should. When Tommy returned with the water and cloths, Warren set about cooling her fever with mechanical precision, the way he'd done for Catherine, the way he'd tried to do for Rose. The memories threatened to drown him, but he pushed them back. This was not then. Elena was not Catherine. He would not fail again. For 3 days, Warren barely left Elena's side. He sent Tommy to stay with Jack's family in the foreman's cottage, unable to expose the boy to whatever illness his mother had contracted. He moved between Elena's room and his study in a fog of exhaustion and fear, sleeping in the chair by her bed in short, fitful bursts. She cycled through fever dreams, crying out for her dead husband, calling for Tommy, once even whispering Catherine's name after catching sight of the wedding photograph on the dresser. Warren bathed her burning skin, forced water between her cracked lips, changed sweat-soaked sheets with a tenderness that surprised him. On the second night, when her fever spiked dangerously high and Warren genuinely feared losing her, she opened her eyes with sudden clarity and grabbed his wrist. "Promise me," she gasped, her grip surprisingly strong. "Promise me if I die, you'll take care of Tommy. Don't send him to an orphanage. Don't let him become charity. Promise me." "You're not going to die." But Warren's voice lacked conviction. "Promise me." Her eyes were wild with fever and terror. "He's a good boy. He won't be trouble. He knows how to work, how to stay quiet. Just don't let them put him in one of those places. Promise me, Warren." It was the first time she'd used his given name. The intimacy of it, combined with the rawness of her plea, cracked something fundamental in his chest. Warren covered her hand with his, felt the heat of her fever burning through both their skins. "I promise. If anything happens to you, Tommy stays with me. He'll always have a home here. Always." The words came out fierce, absolute. "But you're not dying, Elena, you hear me? I didn't pull you from the snow just to watch you slip away in my damned guest room. You're going to fight this, and you're going to win because that boy needs his mother." "He needs a father, too," Elena whispered, her eyes already closing again. "Needs someone who sees him. Someone who—" She drifted back into fever dreams, but her words echoed in Warren's head for hours afterward. Tommy needed a father. And Warren who'd buried his own child, who'd sworn never to care about anyone again, had somehow become the closest thing to that the boy had. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it settled into his chest with the weight of truth. On the morning of the 4th day, Elena's fever finally broke. Warren woke in his chair to find her watching him with clear, exhausted eyes. Relief hit him so hard he had to grip the armrest to stay upright. "You look terrible," Elena croaked, her voice like gravel. "You've looked better yourself." Warren stood on stiff legs, moved to pour her water. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses. How long was I—" "3 days. Your fever broke during the night." He helped her sit up enough to drink, supported her weight when her arms shook. "You gave us quite a scare." "Tommy is fine. He's been staying with Jack and his wife, eating them out of house and home, according to Jack, and asking every hour when he can come back." Warren eased her back against the pillows. "I told him you needed rest and quiet to recover. He made you a drawing. I'll bring it up later." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "You took care of me." "Someone had to. You were determined to work yourself to death." Warren's voice came out rougher than intended. "Why didn't you tell me you were sick?" "Because I couldn't afford to be sick." Elena wiped at her eyes with shaking hands. "Because we're living on your charity, and charity has limits. If I couldn't work, couldn't earn my keep, then what good was I? Why would you keep us?" The words hit Warren like a physical blow. You think I'd throw you out for being ill? I don't know what to think. Elena's voice broke. I don't know the rules here, Warren. I don't know what's expected, what's allowed, where the boundaries are. I'm living in your dead wife's favorite room. My son follows you around like a puppy, and I tend your fires at night like some kind of... She stopped, seemed to realize she was saying too much. I don't know what we are to you. Charity cases? Temporary help? Penance for something? And I was so afraid that if I showed weakness, showed need, you'd remember that we're just strangers you took in out of pity. Warren stood frozen, her words unpacking truths he'd been avoiding for weeks. What were they to him? When had the widow and her son stopped being temporary inconveniences and become something else entirely? You're not strangers. The admission felt like pulling glass from a wound. Haven't been for a long time. And you're not here out of pity. You're here because... He stopped, struggled with words that didn't come naturally. Because this house was dead before you came. Because I was dead. And you're right. I don't know what you are to me either. But I know that when you collapsed, I was more frightened than I've been since... He couldn't finish, couldn't say it. Since your wife and daughter died. Elena's voice was soft, understanding. Yes. The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Warren moved to the window, stared out at the frozen landscape. I can't do this again, Elena. I can't care about people who are going to leave. I can't build something just to watch it fall apart. I'm not strong enough. Then maybe you shouldn't have saved us from the snow. There was no accusation in Elena's voice, just resignation. Maybe you should have left us to freeze, because the moment you opened that door, the moment you brought us inside, you started caring whether you meant to or not. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry we've become an inconvenience to your grief. Warren turned to face her, saw the tears streaming down her pale face, saw the exhaustion and shame and bone-deep weariness of a woman who'd been fighting for so long she'd forgotten what peace felt like. You're not an inconvenience. The words came out raw, honest. You're terrifying, both of you. You've cracked open walls I spent 7 years building, and I don't know how to function without them. I don't know how to care about people without it destroying me, but... He moved back to her bedside, sat heavily in his chair. But I care anyway. Despite my best efforts, despite every wall I've built, I care about whether you're warm at night and whether Tommy is learning his letters and whether this damned house feels like a home again. And that scares me more than anything has scared me in 7 years. Elena reached out with one trembling hand, covered his where it rested on the chair arm. I'm scared too. I'm scared of hoping for something permanent when I know it can't last. I'm scared of Tommy getting attached to a man who's going to send us away when spring comes. I'm scared of wanting a life I can't have. What do you want? Warren asked, his voice rough. I want Tommy to grow up safe. I want a home that's ours, not borrowed. I want to stop being scared all the time. Elena's grip tightened on his hand. And I want to matter to someone again, to be more than just a burden or a responsibility. I want someone to be glad I exist. Warren looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers threaded through his like they belonged there. I'm glad you exist, he said quietly. For what it's worth. I'm glad you knocked on my door in that storm. I'm glad you tend my fires. I'm glad you made Catherine's apple cake and taught Tommy about kindness and pulled me back from the edge of something I didn't even know I was falling into. I'm glad, Elena. She was crying openly now, and Warren found his own eyes burning. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, words hanging between them like promises neither of them knew how to keep. A knock at the door broke the spell. Jack's voice called through the wood. Mr. Blackwood, sorry to disturb, but there's trouble in town. You're needed. Warren squeezed Elena's hand once, then stood. What kind of trouble? The bad kind, sir. You'd better come hear it for yourself. Warren looked back at Elena, saw her trying to sit up despite her obvious weakness. Stay in bed. I'll handle whatever this is. Warren. She stopped, seemed to gather her courage. Be careful. He nodded once, sharp and sure, then left before he could do something foolish like promise he'd come back. He'd learned better than to make promises he couldn't guarantee. Jack waited at the bottom of the stairs, his weathered face grave. It's about Mrs. Frost, sir.
Word's gotten out that you've got a widow living here, and people are talking.
Warren's hands clenched into fists. What kind of talking? The bad kind. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile came by earlier asking questions. How long she's been here, what arrangements you've made, whether there's propriety being maintained. Jack looked uncomfortable. She's got the church ladies all worked up. They're saying a single man and a widow under one roof, it's not decent. They're saying Mrs. Frost must be taking advantage, working some kind of angle. That's ridiculous. Warren's voice was cold with fury. Elena has been nothing but, she's been proper and respectful, and I know that, sir. You know that. But the town doesn't know that. They see a poor widow show up in the middle of winter and suddenly she's living in the Blackwood house, and their imaginations run wild. Jack shifted his weight. Mrs. Henderson suggested that if Mrs. Frost is going to continue staying here, there ought to be oversight, someone from the church to make sure everything's above board. Oversight. Warren bit the word out like poison. They want to put a chaperone in my own house. Or they want Mrs. Frost gone. Those seem to be the options they're proposing. Warren stared at his foreman, at this man who'd worked for him for 15 years, who'd watched him bury his wife and daughter and slowly die himself. What do you think I should do, Jack? Jack met his eyes steadily. I think you should do what makes you less alone, sir. And I think that woman upstairs and her boy have done more to bring you back to life in 2 months than anything else has managed in 7 years. So I think you should tell Mrs. Henderson and her church ladies to mind their own damn business and let a good man and a good woman figure out their own lives. The loyalty in Jack's voice made Warren's throat tight. And if the town decides to make trouble, then the town can come through me first. Jack's jaw set stubbornly. You've got friends here, Mr. Blackwood, more than you think. Not everyone in this county is a busybody with nothing better to do than spread gossip. Warren nodded slowly, but his mind was racing. He'd been naive to think that Elena and Tommy could stay here indefinitely without consequences. Small towns had long memories and sharp tongues, and a widow living with a widower was exactly the kind of scandal people loved to sink their teeth into. He thought of Elena upstairs, weak and recovering, terrified of being thrown out. He thought of Tommy at Jack's cottage, drawing pictures for his sick mother. He thought of the life that had started building itself in his house, fragile and new, and the first good thing he'd felt in years. And he thought of spring coming, of roads clearing, of Elena taking Tommy and leaving, because that had always been the plan. Better to leave on her own terms than be driven out by gossip. The realization hit him like a fist. He didn't want her to leave, didn't want either of them to leave. Somewhere in the past 2 months, they'd stopped being temporary and become essential. Tell Mrs. Henderson that Mrs. Frost is my employee, Warren said finally. A housekeeper, properly compensated. And tell her that any further inquiries about my household staff can be addressed to me directly, in person, at her convenience. Jack's mouth twitched with something that might have been a smile. That should shut her up. Mrs. Henderson's afraid of you. Good. She should be. Warren turned toward his study, then paused. And Jack, thank you for what you said. Just the truth, sir. That's all. After Jack left, Warren stood in his study and stared at the ledgers on his desk without seeing them. A housekeeper. An employee. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that protected them both. It gave Elena legitimacy, gave her position in his household a name that the town could accept, but it also locked them into roles that felt wrong. Because Elena wasn't his employee, she was, what? His friend? His companion. The woman who'd cracked open his frozen heart and made him feel human again? Warren sat down heavily, dropped his head into his hands. The past 2 months had been an exercise in self-deception. He told himself Elena and Tommy were temporary. He told himself he was being charitable, practical, that housing them through the winter was just basic human decency. He told himself he wasn't getting attached, wasn't caring, wasn't building something that would destroy him when it ended. All lies. Comfortable lies that had let him pretend he was in control. But control had slipped through his fingers weeks ago, probably that very first night when he'd pretended to sleep and heard Elena teaching her son about kindness to wounded men. He'd been falling since then, a slow descent into caring that he'd been too stubborn to acknowledge. And now the town was forcing his hand. Now he had to make decisions, take positions, Commit to something beyond the careful neutrality he'd been hiding behind. Warren pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. If Elena was going to be his employee, she'd have a proper contract. Room and board, a salary, defined duties. Something legal that would shut the gossips up and give her security beyond his uncertain charity. But as he wrote, he realized he was building a cage as much as a protection, because an employee left when the job was done. An employee didn't stay because they wanted to, but because they were paid to. And what Warren wanted, what he'd barely admitted to himself he wanted, was for Elena and Tommy to stay because they chose to, not because economics demanded it. He was still wrestling with the contract when he heard a sound from upstairs, a thud, followed by a cry. Warren was moving before thought caught up, taking the stairs two at a time. He found Elena on the floor beside her bed, her face white with pain and shame. "I'm sorry. I just needed to... I thought I could..." "You thought you could what? Walk?" Warren scooped her up, set her back on the bed with more force than gentleness. "You're recovering from a serious fever. You need to stay in bed." "I needed the washroom. I didn't want to..." Elena's face flushed. "I didn't want to bother you." "So you'd rather fall and crack your skull open?" Warren pulled the blankets over her with sharp, angry movements. But the anger was fear wearing a different mask, and they both knew it. "You scared me half to death, again." "I'm sorry." Elena's voice was small. "I just didn't want to be more trouble than I already am." Warren sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "You heard then, about the town talking." "The walls aren't that thick. I heard Jack." Elena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You should have let me die in the snow. Would have been simpler." "Don't say that." Warren's voice was sharp. "Don't ever say that." "Why not? It's true. I've brought nothing but complications into your life. You were fine before we came. You had your routine, your isolation, your... I was dying." The words burst from Warren like a dam breaking. "I was dying slowly in this tomb I'd built for myself. I was going through motions without living. I was..." He stopped, tried to find words for something he'd never let himself acknowledge. "You didn't complicate my life, Elena. You saved it. You and Tommy. You cracked me open and let the light back in, and yes, it hurts like hell, and yes, I'm terrified, but I'm also alive again. For the first time in 7 years, I'm alive." Elena stared at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Then what do we do? Because the town isn't going to accept this. They're going to make it impossible for us to stay." "Let me worry about the town." Warren stood, moved toward the door. "You focus on getting better. We'll figure out the rest when you're back on your feet." "Warren?" Her voice stopped him. "Thank you for taking care of me, for keeping your promise about Tommy, for everything." He nodded without turning around, afraid of what his face might reveal, afraid she'd see too much of the truth written there, that she'd become necessary to him, that the thought of her leaving felt like another death, that he was falling into something he had no name for and no idea how to navigate. Warren returned to his study and stared at the unfinished contract. Employee. Housekeeper. The words felt like betrayals. But what alternative did he have? He couldn't offer marriage. That felt like a desecration of Catherine's memory, like replacing someone irreplaceable. He couldn't ask Elena to stay without status, without protection. The town would eat her alive, and he couldn't let her leave, couldn't watch her and Tommy walk away into an uncertain future when he had the means to keep them safe. He was trapped between impossible choices, each one guaranteed to hurt someone. And Warren Blackwood, who'd spent 7 years avoiding exactly this kind of pain, discovered that caring about people meant accepting that sometimes there were no good options. Sometimes you just had to choose which wound you could live with. He picked up his pen and kept writing, building a structure of employment and duty that felt like a lie but might be the only truth they could afford. The contract sat on Warren's desk for 3 days, unsigned. Every time he picked up the pen to finalize it, something stopped him. Some unnamed resistance that made his hand freeze over the paper. The words were all there, neat and legal, offering Elena the position of housekeeper with fair wages and defined responsibilities. It should have been simple. It should have solved everything. But it felt like a surrender to something Warren couldn't quite name. Elena recovered slowly, regaining strength in increments that felt agonizingly gradual. Tommy returned from Jack's cottage and barely left his mother's side, reading to her from the few books Warren had, bringing her water, adjusting her pillows with the earnest dedication of a child trying to fix the unfixable. Warren watched them together and felt something twist in his chest, a longing so sharp it bordered on pain. This was what family looked like, what it sounded like, and for 7 years he'd convinced himself he could live without it. On the 4th day after Elena's fever broke, Warren was in the barn when he heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. He stepped out into the weak February sunlight to find 5 men riding toward his house, led by Sheriff Morrison and followed by Mrs. Henderson, the mercantile owner, her husband, and 2 men Warren recognized as church deacons. His stomach dropped. This wasn't a social call. Morrison. Warren's voice was flat as he walked to meet them. "What brings you out here?" The sheriff dismounted, his weathered face apologetic but determined. "Mr. Blackwood, sorry to disturb you, but we've had some concerns raised about your household situation. Thought it best to address them directly." Concerns. Warren's hands clenched at his sides. What kind of concerns? Mrs. Henderson spoke up before the sheriff could answer, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. "Concerns about propriety, Mr. Blackwood. It's been brought to our attention that you've been harboring a single woman and her child for nearly 2 months now, without proper oversight, without appropriate arrangements. Surely you understand how that appears." "How it appears," Warren repeated slowly, his voice dangerous, "is that I took in a widow and her child who would have frozen to death otherwise. How it appears is basic human decency. No one's questioning your initial charity." One of the deacons spoke up, his tone condescending. "But charity has its limits. 2 months is well beyond what's appropriate for an unrelated woman to be living in a bachelor's household. People are talking, Mr. Blackwood, and what they're saying isn't flattering to you or to Mrs. Frost." Warren felt rage building in his chest, hot and sharp. "Let me understand this. You're here because people are gossiping? Because small minds have nothing better to do than speculate about things that don't concern them?" "It concerns the moral character of our community." Mrs. Henderson's chin lifted. "And I'll remind you that Mrs. Frost has a young son. That boy needs proper guidance, proper examples. What kind of lessons is he learning in a household with no moral oversight? The kind of lessons that teach him kindness, hard work, and dignity." Warren's voice cut like a blade. "More than he'd learn from a pack of busybodies who measure morality by gossip rather than action." Sheriff Morrison held up a hand. "Let's all calm down. Mr. Blackwood, I think what folks are trying to say, poorly, maybe, is that there's concern about Mrs. Frost's situation. Is she here voluntarily? Is she being properly compensated? Are there appropriate arrangements being maintained?" "Elena is my employee." The lie felt like ash in Warren's mouth, but he forced it out. "I've hired her as my housekeeper. She's compensated fairly and treated with complete respect. Any other questions about my household staff can be directed to me personally, and I'll thank you all to keep your noses out of my private business." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Employee? With what contract? What terms? Who witnessed these arrangements?" Warren felt the trap closing. He had the contract, unsigned, sitting on his desk inside. But producing it now would look like a hasty fabrication, would make Elena's position seem even more questionable. Before he could answer, a voice spoke from behind him. "I did." Warren turned to find Jack standing there, his expression calm but his eyes hard. "I witnessed Mr. Blackwood's employment offer to Mrs. Frost 6 weeks ago. Room, board, and fair wages in exchange for housekeeping duties. All proper and above board." It was a lie. A complete fabrication. But Jack delivered it with such steady conviction that even Warren almost believed it. Mrs. Henderson wasn't convinced. 6 weeks ago? Why wasn't this made public knowledge? Why all the secrecy? "Because it's no one's business but ours." Warren's voice dropped to something cold and final. "Mrs. Frost is my employee. She works for me, in my house, under terms we agreed upon. That's all anyone needs to know. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He turned to walk away, but Mrs. Henderson's voice stopped him. "There's one more thing, Mr. Blackwood. We'd like to speak with Mrs. Frost directly. Make sure she's comfortable with these arrangements." Warren spun back, his face dark with fury. Absolutely not. Mrs. Frost is recovering from a serious illness. She doesn't need a pack of vultures descending on her sickbed to interrogate her about gossip. Then how do we know she's even here voluntarily? Mr. Henderson spoke up for the first time. How do we know you haven't coerced her somehow? A desperate woman, a wealthy man. It's not unheard of for such situations to become... Warren moved so fast that Jack had to grab his arm to stop him from doing something he'd regret. Finish that sentence, Warren growled, and see what happens. Easy. Sheriff Morrison stepped between them, his hand on Warren's chest. Nobody's accusing anybody of anything criminal, but you have to admit from the outside this looks questionable. A woman with no resources, no family, completely dependent on your charity? That creates a power imbalance that concerns people. Then people should mind their own business. Warren shook off Jack's grip, but stepped back. Elena came to my door in a storm. I took her in because leaving her to die would have been murder by neglect. She stayed because winter made travel impossible. And now she stays because I offered her honest work and she accepted. That's the whole story. There's no scandal, no coercion, no impropriety, just basic human decency and honest labor. Then you won't mind if we verify that with Mrs. Frost herself. Mrs. Henderson's voice was syrupy with false concern. Just to make sure she feels the same way, for her protection, of course. Warren was about to refuse again when Elena's voice cut through the cold morning air. That won't be necessary. Everyone turned to see her standing in the doorway of the house, wrapped in a shawl, her face still too pale but her spine straight with dignity. Tommy stood beside her, his small hand gripping her skirt, his eyes wide and frightened. Mrs. Frost. Sheriff Morrison removed his hat. Ma'am, you should be resting. We didn't mean to disturb, and yet here you are, disturbing. Elena's voice was quiet but carried across the yard with surprising force. I'll save you all the trouble of your interrogation. Yes, I'm here voluntarily. Yes, Mr. Blackwood has treated me with nothing but respect and propriety. Yes, I'm employed as his housekeeper under fair terms. And yes, my son and I are staying here by choice, not coercion. But surely you can see how it looks, Mrs. Henderson began. I can see exactly how it looks to people who measure virtue by appearances rather than actions. Elena's eyes flashed with steel. I can see that a man who saved our lives, when he had every reason to turn us away, is being accused of impropriety by people who've never once offered us shelter or assistance. I can see that you're all very concerned with morality in theory, but seem to have forgotten what it looks like in practice. Warren stared at her, this woman who should have been weak and grateful, who instead stood in his doorway and faced down her accusers with the kind of quiet fury that made even Mrs. Henderson take a step back. We're just trying to protect you, one of the deacons said. A woman in your position. My position? Elena's laugh was bitter. My position is that I'm alive. My son is alive. We have food and warmth and safety for the first time in months, all because one man looked at two strangers freezing in a blizzard and decided that basic human decency mattered more than convenience. You want to question his morality? Question your own first. Ask yourselves where you were when we were starving. Ask yourselves what you've done for anyone lately that didn't come with judgment and conditions. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone red. The deacons looked uncomfortable, and even the sheriff seemed taken aback by Elena's fierce defense. I think, Sheriff Morrison said carefully, that we've established Mrs. Frost is here of her own free will. Perhaps we should... The sound of rushing water cut him off. Everyone turned toward the creek that ran along the northern edge of Warren's property. What had been a frozen trickle that morning was now a torrent, chunks of ice crashing along its banks as the unseasonable warmth of the past few days suddenly made itself catastrophically clear. The ice dam, Jack breathed. It's breaking. Warren's blood ran cold. Upstream, where the creek widened into what passed for a river in Kansas, the winter's accumulated ice and snow formed natural dams. When they broke, as they inevitably did each spring, the result was a flash flood that could tear through the prairie with devastating force. And it was breaking now. Weeks early. Right toward them. Everyone to high ground. Warren was already moving, his mind cataloging what needed to be saved, where people needed to go. The house should hold, but the barn. Jack, get the horses out. Morrison, help him! The group scattered, previous animosities forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Warren ran toward Elena, who stood frozen in the doorway. Get Tommy and get to the second floor. Now! The livestock. I'll handle it. Just get yourself and the boy to safety. But Elena didn't move. Warren? The money? Your wife's things. The nursery. If the water reaches the house... Warren's heart stopped. Rose's room. Catherine's jewelry. 7 years of memories stored on the ground floor, vulnerable to the water he could already hear roaring toward them. He made a decision in the space between heartbeats. Second floor, now! That's an order. Then he was running for the house, taking the stairs 3 at a time. The nursery door, locked for 7 years, stood before him like a judgment. Warren's hands shook as he fumbled with the key he'd kept on his watch chain, the key he'd carried every day but never used. The lock turned. The door swung open. The smell hit him first, dust and old grief, and the faint ghost of lavender from Catherine's sachets. The room was exactly as they'd left it, Rose's cradle in the corner, Catherine's rocking chair by the window. The trunk containing baby clothes, christening gowns, tiny shoes for feet that would never wear them. Warren stood paralyzed, 7 years crashing over him like the floodwater rushing toward the house. This was why he'd locked the door. This was what he'd been protecting himself from. The physical evidence of everything he'd lost, preserved like a shrine to pain. Warren? Elena's voice from downstairs. The water's coming! It broke his paralysis. Warren grabbed the trunk, heavier than he remembered, and hauled it toward the door. He made 2 more trips, Catherine's jewelry box, the baby cradle, the photograph albums Elena had mentioned seeing in the guest room. Each item felt like carrying pieces of his heart up the stairs, exposing them to air and light they hadn't seen in years. By the time he'd moved everything essential to the second floor, water was seeping under the front door. Warren splashed through the rapidly rising flood to find Elena and Tommy huddled in the upstairs hallway, their faces white with fear. Is it going to reach us? Tommy asked, his voice small. Warren looked out the window at the devastation below. The barn was already half submerged. The water was rising faster than he'd anticipated, fed by the breaking ice dam and the sudden thaw. The first floor would flood completely. Whether the water would reach the second floor depended on how much ice was still coming down from upstream. I don't know, Warren admitted, unwilling to lie. But we're safer up here than anywhere else. The house is solid. It'll hold. They waited in tense silence as the water rose. Warren could hear it lapping against the stairs, could see debris floating past the windows, tree branches, pieces of fence, what looked like someone's chicken coop from downstream. The roar was deafening, punctuated by the crack of ice chunks slamming into the house's foundation. Tommy pressed against his mother, trying hard not to cry. Elena's arm was around him, but her eyes were on Warren, looking for reassurance he wasn't sure he could provide. The nursery, she said quietly. You opened it. Warren nodded, not trusting his voice. That must have been hard. Everything's hard. He moved to the window, checking the water level. It had reached the middle of the first floor windows and seemed to be stabilizing. Maybe they'd be lucky. Maybe the worst of the flood would pass them by. Then he saw Jack struggling through the water toward the house, leading 3 terrified horses. Behind him, Sheriff Morrison was helping Mrs. Henderson and her husband, both of whom looked half-drowned and completely terrified. The deacons were nowhere to be seen. Hopefully they'd made it to higher ground downstream. They're coming here, Elena said. They need shelter. Warren looked at her, at this woman who had every reason to let the people who'd come to harass her drown, and saw only concern in her eyes. No vindictiveness, no satisfaction at seeing her accusers humbled, just human compassion for people in danger. The front door's underwater, Warren said. They'll have to come through the second-floor window. He spent the next frantic minutes rigging a rope system to pull people through the upstairs window that overlooked the porch roof. Jack came first, hauling himself up with practiced ease before helping Warren pull up the others. The horses had to be left in the partially flooded barn. There was no way to get them to the second floor, but Jack had gotten them into stalls on the highest ground possible. They'd survive if the water didn't rise much more. Mrs. Henderson came through the window, soaked and shivering, her self-righteous indignation washed away along with her dignity. Her husband was in worse shape, and Morrison looked exhausted from helping them both navigate the flood. They all stood dripping in Warren's upstairs hallway. The people who'd come to question his morality now completely depended on his charity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Elena moved past Warren without a word, went to the linen closet and started pulling out blankets and towels. "Get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. Tommy, help me get the spare room ready." "But Mama, they were mean to you." "I know, baby, but that doesn't mean we let them freeze." Elena's voice was gentle but firm. "Being better than our circumstances, that's what matters, remember?" Tommy nodded slowly, then surprised everyone by approaching Mrs. Henderson with a towel. "Here, ma'am, you're shaking." Mrs. Henderson took the towel with trembling hands, her face crumpling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We were wrong to come here like that. Wrong to question. I'm so sorry." "Save the apologies for when we're all dry and safe," Warren said brusquely, uncomfortable with emotion. "Elena's right. Let's focus on surviving the night. We can sort everything else out later." They spent the next several hours huddled together in the upper floor of Warren's house while the floodwater raged below. Warren's pantry was mostly on the ground floor, unreachable, but Elena had been storing extra supplies in the upstairs linen closet, a habit formed from years of uncertainty. They had enough food for a few days if they were careful. As night fell and the water showed no signs of receding, the group settled into an uneasy truce. Mrs. Henderson and her husband took the guest room. Sheriff Morrison bunked with Jack in the small storage room Warren had been using for keeping extra blankets. Elena and Tommy remained in their usual room, and Warren found himself with nowhere to go except the hallway floor, or, "You should sleep in your wife's room," Elena said quietly, finding him staring at the closed door at the end of the hall. "It's yours. You should use it." Warren looked at that door, at the room he'd locked along with the nursery, and shook his head. "Can't. Haven't been in there since she died." Elena's voice was gentle. "I know. But Warren, you opened the nursery today. You saved all those precious things. Maybe it's time to stop locking yourself out of your own life." "I don't know how." The admission came out raw, broken. Elena took his hand, her touch warm despite the cold. "Then let me help you. Just for tonight. Just to get through this." She led him to the door, turned the handle. It wasn't locked, had never been locked like the nursery, and opened it into darkness. Warren felt his chest constrict, felt 7 years of avoidance crashing over him. But Elena's hand in his kept him grounded, kept him from drowning. She lit a lamp, and the room emerged from shadow. Catherine's room. Their room. The bed they'd shared, the dresser with her hairbrush still sitting on top, the wardrobe containing dresses he couldn't bear to give away. It was a museum to a life interrupted, and walking into it felt like stepping into his own grave. "Breathe," Elena instructed softly. "Just breathe." Warren realized he'd been holding his breath, his chest locked tight with panic. He forced air into his lungs, forced himself to look around instead of running. "It's just a room," Elena said. "The memories are hard, I know, but it's just a room. It doesn't have power unless you give it power." "She died in that bed," Warren's voice broke. "I held her while she... I know. And you've been carrying that moment like a stone for 7 years. But Warren, she also lived in this room. She laughed here, dreamed here, loved you here. This room held more than just her death. It held her whole life with you." Warren sank onto the edge of the bed, his hands shaking. Elena sat beside him, not touching, but present, solid and real in a way that memories couldn't be. "My husband died in our bed too," she said quietly. "After, I couldn't sleep there for months. I'd lie on the floor, on the sofa, anywhere but where he'd taken his last breath. I thought avoiding it would make it hurt less. Did it? No. It just meant I was uncomfortable and hurting instead of just hurting." Elena's smile was sad. "Eventually I realized something. He wouldn't have wanted me to make myself miserable over his memory. He'd have wanted me to live, to be comfortable, to let myself heal." "Catherine would have wanted that too," Warren admitted. "She'd be furious with me for locking up the nursery, for turning this house into a tomb." "Then maybe it's time to honor her by living again. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but living." Elena stood, moved toward the door. Get some rest. Real rest. In a real bed. You've earned it. She was almost gone when Warren spoke. Stay. Elena froze. Warren, I don't think... Not like that. Warren's face flushed. I don't want to be alone in here, not yet. Just stay until I fall asleep, please. The vulnerability in his voice seemed to break something in Elena. She nodded slowly, returned to the chair by the window, Catherine's chair, and settled in. All right, but you actually have to try to sleep. Warren lay back on the bed, still fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. The room smelled like dust and old grief, but beneath it he caught traces of Elena's lavender soap, evidence that she'd been coming in here to clean, to care for this space, even when he'd abandoned it. Thank you, he said into the darkness, for defending me today. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Elena's voice was firm. They were wrong, Warren. Wrong to come here with their gossip and accusations. Wrong to question your decency when you've shown more of it than most people manage in a lifetime. I'm not decent. I'm selfish. I took you in partly because I wanted to prove people were terrible, and you ruined that by being kind. Elena's laugh was soft. Then I'm glad I ruined it. Your cynicism needed ruining. They fell into comfortable silence. Outside, the flood raged on, but inside, in this room that had been locked in grief, something was finally beginning to thaw. Elena? Warren's voice was drowsy, sleep finally pulling him under. Yes? When this is over, when the water recedes and everyone goes home, don't leave. Please don't take Tommy and leave. I know I have no right to ask. I know it's selfish, but shh. Elena's voice was impossibly gentle. Sleep, Warren. We'll figure everything out when morning comes. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even an answer. But it was enough to let Warren finally, after 7 years of grief and months of resistance, fall asleep in his own bed with something that felt almost like peace settling over him. And in the chair by the window, Elena Frost watched over him through the long, dark hours, keeping vigil the way she'd done every night since arriving. But this time, in this room, heavy with memory and possibility, it felt like something more than duty. It felt like choice, like the future slowly, painfully, beautifully beginning to right itself. Dawn broke gray and cold over the flooded prairie. Warren woke to find himself alone in the room, Elena's chair empty, and the sound of voices downstairs. He sat up slowly, disoriented by having slept in this bed after so many years, then remembered the flood, the unexpected house guests, everything that had happened yesterday. He found Elena in the kitchen, or what was left of it. The water had receded overnight, leaving behind a coating of mud and debris that covered everything below waist height. Elena stood in the middle of it all, her skirts hiked up and tied, already scrubbing at the walls with a determination that was both admirable and heartbreaking. "You should have woken me," Warren said from the doorway. Elena turned, her face smudged with mud, but her expression resolute. "You needed rest, and I needed something to do with my hands. Besides, it's not as bad as it looks. The structure's sound. Just needs cleaning, Mrs. Ott." Henderson appeared from the parlor, also mud-splattered, carrying a bucket of dirty water. She stopped when she saw Warren, her face coloring with shame. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to apologize, properly. What we did yesterday, coming here with accusations and judgment, it was wrong. Deeply wrong. And then you saved us anyway. Took us in when you had every right to leave us to the flood. Her voice broke. "I'm so ashamed." Warren looked at this woman who'd led the charge against him yesterday, now standing in his ruined kitchen offering genuine contrition. The flood makes people rethink things. Don't mistake gratitude for actual change of heart. It's not gratitude. Mrs. Henderson set down her bucket, met his eyes directly. "It's clarity. Watching Mrs. Frost care for us last night, seeing how she treats everyone with kindness regardless of how they've treated her, seeing how your household actually functions, I realized I'd been judging something I knew nothing about. I'd been listening to gossip instead of truth. That's on me, Mr. Blackwood. And I'm sorry." Elena emerged from behind Warren, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Henderson has been helping me clean since dawn. She didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Mrs. Henderson's voice was firm. I made assumptions about you, Mrs. Frost. Thought a poor widow living with a wealthy man must be up to something. Never occurred to me that maybe you're just a woman trying to survive, and he's just a man trying to do the right thing. My mother would have been ashamed of me. Sheriff Morrison and Mr. Henderson came in from outside, both covered in mud from trying to assess the damage. Morrison pulled off his hat when he saw Warren. The barn's in rough shape, but salvageable. Lost some fence posts and your south pasture is a mess, but the house foundation held solid. You built well. My father built well, Warren corrected. I just maintained it. Still, Morrison shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. About yesterday, we were out of line, all of us. No excuse for it. You've been nothing but generous, and we repaid you with suspicion and gossip. I'll make sure word gets around town about what really happened here, about how you saved people who'd come to harass you. I'd rather you didn't spread any word at all. Warren's voice was tired. I'd rather people just left us alone to live our lives. Unfortunately, that ship has sailed. Jack appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. There's more people coming. Looks like half the town, actually. Word must have spread about the flood. Warren felt his stomach sink. More busybodies, more judgment, more people who wanted to poke their noses into his business. But when he looked out the window, he saw something unexpected. The approaching group wasn't empty-handed. They came with wagons loaded with supplies, tools, lumber, and leading them was Pastor Williams, the elderly minister who'd presided over Catherine and Rose's funerals. "Warren Blackwood," Williams called out as he approached. "Heard you took the brunt of the flood. Came to help rebuild." Warren stepped outside, confused and wary. "Pastor, I appreciate the offer, but no buts. You've been part of this community for 30 years. When one of us falls, we all help them back up. That's how it works." Williams gestured to the crowd behind him. "Besides, I hear you've been doing good work yourself, taking in those who need help. About time this town returned the favor." The crowd dispersed with practiced efficiency, different groups tackling different tasks. Some started cleaning out the barn, while others began repairing fences. The women descended on the house, bringing cleaning supplies and food, and organizing themselves with the kind of terrifying competence that made Warren want to retreat to his study. But his study was currently being scrubbed by 3 church ladies who'd taken over with such authority that Warren didn't dare protest. Pastor Williams pulled Warren aside while the chaos unfolded around them. "I heard about yesterday, about Margaret Henderson and her committee coming out here with accusations." "It's handled," Warren said stiffly. "I'm sure it is. But I wanted you to know that wasn't sanctioned by the church. That was busybodies using religion as an excuse for gossip. There's a difference." Williams paused, his old eyes sharp and knowing. "I also wanted to say, I'm glad to see you living again. Catherine would have been pleased." Warren's throat tightened. "You don't know that." "I do, actually. Your wife and I had many conversations while she was ill. She was terrified of what would happen to you after she was gone, worried you'd lock yourself away, turn bitter and hard. Made me promise I'd check on you." Williams's smile was sad. "I failed that promise. Got too caught up in other people's problems, let you drift. But I'm glad to see I was wrong about how far you drifted. Seems like Mrs. Frost has been the answer to Catherine's prayers." "Catherine never prayed for me to take in a widow," Warren said roughly. "No, she prayed for you to find a reason to keep living, for your heart to thaw enough to let life back in. Doesn't matter what form that takes. Could be a widow, could be her son, could be a barn cat. What matters is you're not dead anymore. You're angry and scared and confused, but you're alive. That's what she wanted." The words hit Warren like a physical blow. He'd spent 7 years convinced that honoring Catherine's memory meant preserving his grief, maintaining the walls, refusing to move forward. But what if he'd been wrong? What if the greatest dishonor to her memory was wasting the life she'd have wanted him to live? "I don't know how to do this," Warren admitted, the words barely audible. "Don't know how to care about people again without being terrified of losing them." "Nobody knows how. That's what makes it brave." Williams clapped him on the shoulder. "But I'll tell you what I've learned in 50 years of ministry. You can't protect yourself from loss by refusing to love. You just end up losing everything anyway, including yourself. At least if you love, you get something beautiful before the inevitable pain. Warren watched Elena through the window, directing the cleaning efforts with quiet authority, Tommy at her side helping where he could. She caught Warren's eye and smiled, a real smile, warm and open and completely without guardedness. His chest ached with the enormity of what that smile represented. He'd tested her for selfishness and found kindness. He'd built walls and she'd quietly dismantled them. He'd locked away his heart and she'd picked the lock without him even noticing. And now he stood at a crossroads. He could let her leave when spring came, could preserve his careful isolation and call it honor. Or he could do the terrifying thing and ask her to stay, not as an employee, not as charity, but as something permanent. The thought should have filled him with panic. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in 7 years. By midday, the house was mostly cleaned. The barn was structurally sound, the livestock accounted for and safe. The fences would take weeks to fully repair, but the immediate crisis had passed. The townspeople began packing up their supplies, satisfied that the Blackwood Ranch would survive. Mrs. Henderson approached Elena as she was wringing out a mop, her expression hesitant. "Mrs. Frost, I wonder if you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you, privately." Elena glanced at Warren, who nodded slightly, then followed Mrs. Henderson outside to the porch. Warren watched through the window, unable to hear but able to see Mrs. Henderson's earnest gestures, Elena's careful listening. "She's apologizing again," Jack said, appearing at Warren's elbow. "Been working up the courage all morning." "She already apologized." "Not properly, not woman to woman." Jack's expression was knowing. Mrs. Henderson's realizing she tried to destroy something good because she couldn't understand it. That sits heavy on a person. Warren grunted, uncomfortable with the emotional complexity. He understood anger, understood grief, understood isolation. But this, forgiveness, community, rebuilding not just structures but relationships, this was foreign territory. Elena came back inside a few minutes later, her eyes bright but her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Henderson invited us to church on Sunday, said she wants to introduce me properly to the community, as your housekeeper, with full respect and legitimacy." "Do you want to go?" Warren asked. "I think I should, for Tommy's sake, if nothing else. He needs to be part of a community, needs to know there's a world beyond this ranch." Elena paused. "But only if you come with us. I won't go if it makes you uncomfortable." Warren looked at her, at this woman who was still giving him choices, still protecting his boundaries even as she dismantled his walls. "I'll go. It's time I stopped hiding." The words felt like a vow, like something significant had just shifted between them. Elena's smile was soft with understanding, and Warren felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. By evening, everyone had left except Jack, who was staying in the foreman's cottage and insisted on helping with evening chores. Warren found himself alone with Elena and Tommy in the cleaned kitchen, eating a simple dinner cobbled together from donated supplies. "Mr. Blackwood?" Tommy asked suddenly. "Are you going to make Mama leave when spring comes?" The question dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Elena's face went pale, her fork freezing halfway to her mouth. Warren set down his own fork carefully, buying himself time to formulate an answer. "Where did you hear that?" he asked. "I heard Mama talking to herself. She does that sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. She said spring was coming and we'd have to move on, find our own place." Tommy's lower lip trembled. "But I don't want to leave. I like it here. I like the horses and the barn cats and—" His voice dropped to a whisper. "And I like you." Warren felt his carefully constructed composure threatening to crumble. He looked at Elena, saw her struggling not to cry, saw her trying to figure out how to explain adult complications to a child who only understood the simple truth of wanting to stay. "Tommy," Warren said slowly, carefully, "your mother said that because she's trying to protect you. She doesn't want you to get too attached to something that might not last. She's being wise and cautious, which is what good mothers do." "But does it have to not last?" Tommy's eyes were enormous, pleading. "Can't we just stay forever? I promise I'll be good. I'll do all my chores and I won't make noise and I'll be so good you won't even notice I'm here."
"Oh, sweetheart."
Elena pulled Tommy into her arms, her voice breaking. "You're already so good. This isn't about you needing to be better. This is about... It's complicated." "Adults always say that when they mean no," Tommy said, his face muffled against his mother's shoulder. Warren stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need air." He walked out into the cold evening, his breath clouding in front of him, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. Behind him, he heard Elena comforting Tommy, heard the quiet sounds of a mother trying to explain things she didn't fully understand herself. He'd been a coward. That was the truth of it. He'd taken Elena and Tommy in, let them become essential to his daily life, let himself care about them. And then he'd hidden behind the pretense of temporary arrangements because commitment terrified him more than loneliness. But Tommy's question had stripped away all his careful evasions and left him facing the raw truth. He didn't want them to leave. Didn't want to go back to the tomb his house had been before they arrived. Didn't want to spend another 7 years dying slowly in isolation. He wanted them to stay, not as employees or charity cases, but as family. The word terrified him. Family meant vulnerability, meant opening himself up to loss all over again. Family meant caring so much that losing them would destroy him. He'd sworn never to put himself in that position again. But standing in the cold evening air, Warren realized he'd already lost that battle. He already cared that much. He already loved them enough that losing them would destroy him whether they stayed or left. The only question now was whether he was brave enough to admit it. The door opened behind him. Elena stepped out, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "Tommy's gone to bed. I told him we'd talk about it more tomorrow." "What will you tell him?" Warren asked without turning around. "The truth. That we can't stay somewhere we're not wanted permanently. That we're grateful for the time we've had, but we can't build our lives on someone else's charity." Elena's voice was steady despite the pain underneath. "It's not fair to him to let him hope for something that isn't going to happen." "What if it could happen?" Warren turned to face her. "What if I wanted it to happen?" Elena stared at him, her expression caught between hope and disbelief. "Warren, don't say things you don't mean just because Tommy asked a hard question." "I'm not." He stepped closer, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I've been a coward, Elena. I've been hiding behind temporary arrangements because commitment scared me. Because caring about you and Tommy scared me. Because losing my wife and daughter broke something in me I didn't think could be fixed. But you fixed it anyway. You and Tommy, you broke into my tomb and dragged me back to life, and I'm terrified and grateful in equal measure." "Warren," Elena's voice shook. "Let me finish, please." He took a deep breath, forced out words that felt like pulling glass from a wound. "I don't want you to leave in spring. I don't want you to leave ever. I want you and Tommy to stay. Not as my housekeeper, not as charity, but as..." He struggled with the word, with the enormity of what he was offering. "As my family, if you'll have me." The silence stretched between them, fragile and heavy. Elena's face was streaming with tears, her hands pressed to her mouth. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking you to marry me." The words came out rough, uncertain. "I'm asking you to let me be a father to Tommy. I'm asking you to help me turn this house back into a home. I know I'm broken. I know I'm difficult. I know I come with more baggage than any woman should have to carry. But I also know I love you, both of you, and I'd rather spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that love than spend another day alone." Elena made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You impossible man. You absolutely impossible, stubborn, infuriating man. Do you have any idea how long I've been hoping you'd say something like that? How many nights I've lain awake wondering if what I felt was real or just wishful thinking? Is that a yes?" Warren's heart was hammering so hard he could barely hear over it. "Yes, you fool! Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes!" Elena closed the distance between them, her hands coming up to frame his face. "I love you. I've loved you since the night I found you pretending to sleep in your study. Maybe even before that. And Tommy adores you. You're already the father he needed. You just had to let yourself see it." Warren pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and felt something inside him finally, completely break open. Not the breaking of grief, but the breaking of ice, painful and necessary, and ultimately freeing. He was crying, he realized with distant surprise, actually crying for the first time since Catherine's funeral. But these were different tears. These were the tears of a man letting go of death and choosing life. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the cold evening air, while inside the house Tommy slept peacefully, unaware that his world had just shifted on its axis in the best possible way. When they finally pulled apart, both of them tear-stained and laughing, Warren asked, "Should we tell Tommy tonight?" "Let him sleep. We'll tell him in the morning. Let him wake up to good news for once." Elena smiled up at Warren, her eyes bright with happiness and relief and love. "But Warren, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me we'll do this right. Not quickly, not secretly. I want to marry you in the church, in front of the whole town. I want Tommy standing with us. I want it to be public and witnessed and legitimate, so there's never any question about where we belong or who we are to each other." Warren nodded slowly, understanding what she was asking. She wanted legitimacy, not just for herself, but for Tommy, wanted their family to be recognized and respected. "Pastor Williams can marry us. When you're ready." "I'm ready now. But I think we should wait until spring. Let the town get used to the idea. Let the gossip die down. And," she paused, her expression softening, "and I think you need time to say goodbye properly, to Catherine and Rose, to open their rooms and let yourself grieve all over again, but this time with someone beside you." The wisdom in her words struck Warren deeply. She understood that moving forward didn't mean forgetting, that loving her didn't diminish what he'd had with Catherine. She was giving him permission to hold both loves as sacred, to honor his past while building his future. "You're too good for me," he said roughly. "Probably. But you're stuck with me now." Elena's smile was impish, young, nothing like the exhausted widow who'd collapsed at his gate months ago. "Fair warning, I snore sometimes, and Tommy's an early riser, and I have strong opinions about how kitchens should be organized. Still want to marry me?" "More than I've wanted anything in 7 years." Warren kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips, a brief gentle kiss that held more promise than passion. "We'll do this right. We'll take our time. We'll build something solid." They went back inside together, fingers intertwined, and found Tommy sitting at the top of the stairs in his nightshirt, his eyes wide and hopeful. "I heard," he whispered. "I heard everything. Are you really going to be my papa?" Warren climbed the stairs, knelt down to Tommy's level, and looked into those dark eyes that had watched him with such patient devotion for months. "If you'll have me, I know I'm not your real father." "You're real enough," Tommy interrupted, launching himself into Warren's arms with the complete trust that only children possess. "You're exactly right. Mama chose you, and I choose you too." Warren held the boy close, felt Elena's hand on his shoulder, and understood with sudden clarity that this moment of choosing each other, of committing to building a family from the broken pieces of their separate griefs, this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of love strong enough to carry it. The following Sunday, Warren attended church for the first time in 7 years. He sat in the pew with Elena on one side and Tommy on the other, feeling the weight of the community's eyes, but also feeling their acceptance. Mrs. Henderson had been true to her word, introducing Elena properly as Warren's fiancée, and the gossip had shifted from scandalous speculation to excited congratulations. After the service, Pastor Williams pulled Warren aside. "I'd be honored to perform the ceremony. When were you thinking?" "Spring, when the apple trees bloom." Warren glanced at Elena, who was talking with some of the church ladies, Tommy showing off his drawing to anyone who'd look. "There's an old tree near where Catherine and Rose are buried. I want to plant something new beside it, something living. And I want to marry Elena there, with both my families present, the one I lost and the one I'm building." Williams's eyes grew misty. "That's beautiful, Warren. Catherine would have loved that." "I think so too." Warren paused. "Thank you for not giving up on me, for understanding that grief takes different shapes for different people. We all grieve in our own way. The important thing is that you've found your way through to the other side. That's rare and precious."
Williams smiled. Now go be with your family. They're waiting for you. The winter months passed quickly after that, filled with the work of rebuilding what the flood had damaged and preparing for the wedding. Warren taught Tommy to ride properly, started showing him the business of running a ranch. Elena took over the household completely, not as an employee but as its rightful mistress, making decisions and changes with Warren's full blessing. And slowly, carefully, Warren opened the closed rooms of his house. He and Elena went through Catherine's things together, sorting what to keep and what to give away. Tommy was given Rose's cradle to keep his treasures in, transforming it from a shrine to grief into something useful and loved. The nursery became Tommy's room, filled with the noise and mess of a living child instead of the silence of memory. It hurt. Every step hurt. But Elena was there through all of it, holding Warren's hand when the grief became overwhelming, reminding him that loving her didn't betray Catherine's memory, but honored it by refusing to let love die with her. One evening in March, as the first hints of thaw appeared in the frozen ground, Warren found Elena in Catherine's old room, their room now, staring at the wedding photograph on the dresser. "Does it bother you?" he asked, having her picture there. Elena shook her head. "She was part of your life, part of what made you who you are. I'm not threatened by her memory, Warren. I'm grateful for it. She loved you well, and that love taught you how to love me." Warren wrapped his arms around her from behind, rested his chin on her shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. Happy, hopeful, like the future was something to anticipate instead of endure. That's what love does. It makes us brave enough to hope." Elena turned in his arms, her expression serious. "I need you to know something, though. I'm not trying to replace her. I can't be Catherine. I can only be myself. I don't want Catherine back." Warren said the words carefully, meaning them completely. "I loved her. I'll always love her. But she's gone, and I'm here, and you're here, and what we have is ours. Not a replacement, not a substitute, just ours." Elena's smile was radiant. "Then I think we're going to be all right." Spring arrived with its usual dramatic flair, the snow melting overnight, the ground turning to mud, and then suddenly, impossibly, the world exploding into green. The apple tree near the family graves burst into bloom right on schedule, its branches heavy with white flowers that smelled like hope. Warren's wedding day dawned clear and warm. He stood under the blooming apple tree in his best suit, his heart hammering, watching as Elena walked toward him across the prairie grass. She wore a simple white dress that the church ladies had helped her make, and Tommy walked beside her in his new clothes, carrying the rings on a small velvet pillow. The whole town had turned out, it seemed. Jack stood as Warren's best man, Mrs. Thun. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Sheriff Morrison grinned like he'd personally arranged the whole thing. But Warren only had eyes for Elena, for the way the sunlight caught in her hair, for the smile that was just for him. Pastor Williams began the ceremony with the traditional words, but when he got to the vows, he paused. "Warren and Elena have written their own promises to each other." "Warren?" Warren took Elena's hands, looked into her eyes, and spoke from the heart. "I promise to honor your strength and protect your vulnerability. I promise to be a father to Tommy and to love him as my own. I promise to let you see my grief without hiding behind walls, and to accept your comfort when I need it. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our pasts while embracing our future. And I promise to never take for granted the gift you've given me, the gift of living again." Elena was crying openly, but her voice was steady when she spoke her vows. "I promise to be patient with your grief and gentle with your heart. I promise to make this house a home filled with light and laughter. I promise to let you be the man and father you need to be without trying to make you into something you're not. I promise to choose you every day, even when things are hard. And I promise to remind you for the rest of our lives that you are worthy of love and happiness and all the good things you've been denying yourself." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Warren had commissioned from the jeweler in town. And when Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Warren kissed Elena with a tenderness that made the gathered crowd sigh. But it was Tommy's voice that broke through the reverent silence. "Does this mean I can call you Papa now? For real?" Warren broke away from Elena, knelt down to Tommy's level,
his eyes burning with happy tears. "It means you're stuck with me forever, son. For real." Tommy launched himself at Warren with a whoop of joy, and Elena joined them, and for a moment they stood there, a family built from loss and loneliness and the courage to try again, while the apple tree bloomed above them and the prairie wind whispered promises of spring. The reception was held in the barn, cleaned and decorated by half the county. There was dancing and food and toast that made everyone laugh and cry. Mrs. Henderson apologized to Elena for the third time, and Elena graciously accepted before changing the subject. Jack made a speech about how Warren had been dead for 7 years and was now the most alive man in Kansas, which was only a slight exaggeration. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, Warren stood with Elena on his porch, watching the last guest depart. Tommy was already asleep upstairs, exhausted from the excitement. The house was quiet, but it was a living quiet, the kind that held peace instead of grief. "Are you happy?" Elena asked softly. Warren thought about the question carefully, testing his feelings against the reality. Was he happy? Happiness seemed too small a word for what he felt. He was grateful. He was hopeful. He was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. He was alive in a way he hadn't been in years. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm happy. Scared, but happy." "Good, because I plan to spend the rest of our lives making sure you stay that way." Elena smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the sunset. "We're going to be all right, Warren. All 3 of us. We're going to build something beautiful here." Warren kissed his wife. His wife, the words still felt surreal, and believed her. They would be all right. They would have hard days and grief would circle back around sometimes, because that's what grief did. But they'd face it together, this family cobbled together from broken pieces. Inside the house, the rooms that had been tombs were now filled with life. Catherine's picture still sat on the dresser, and Rose's memory still lived in the cradle repurposed for Tommy's treasures. But alongside those memories, new ones were being made. The sound of Tommy's laughter echoing through the halls, Elena's humming as she worked in the kitchen, Warren's own voice raised in conversation instead of silence. The house on the Kansas plains had survived blizzards and floods and 7 years of grief, and now it would survive happiness, would learn to hold joy again, would remember what it felt like to be a home instead of a monument. Warren Blackwood stood on his porch with his wife beside him, watching the sun set over land that had witnessed both his deepest sorrow and his unexpected redemption, and knew with bone-deep certainty that he'd been given the rarest of gifts, a second chance at life. And he was finally, after all these years, brave enough to take it.